Allen, Bates, Bates present, Berryhill, Gaines, Hertzberg, Leyva, Leyva present, Liu present, McGuire, McGuire present, Mendoza, Pavley, Mendoza present, Pavley, Wykowski, Wykowski present.
Thank you, everybody. We'd like to call, if it's okay with Senator Bates, we'll call Senator Huff up and have our second discussion on the Constitution. So, Senator Huff, we had our discussion last week, and I wanted to ask you to make any additional comments.
Well, I think you can probably recite along with me, Mr. Chairman, members, about this bill.
Are you tired of talking about it?
I think, you know, this was driven by trying to find consensus within our caucus about what made the most sense when we're trying to address the transportation infrastructure funding crisis that we find ourselves in. That being that the money is already paid into transportation, ought to go to transportation. It seems kind of like common sense. That doesn't always prevail here. So that's what led to the construction of SCA X1. And, you know, absent any specific questions, I think I'll just leave it at that. That the main component of this is protecting the truck weight fees currently diverted to the general fund to pay for the bonds. And then also the $100 million of HUDA funds, and it would protect any existing funds from being borrowed like that in the future, as well as any new funds that might be generated through whatever action the legislature takes this year. So with that, I look forward to your questions, and we'll see where we go.
I want to say thank you for working on this with us, and I don't think the Constitution amendment right now is perfect, but I think for purposes of continuing discussion, we ought to move the constitutional amendment forward for further discussion. And I believe we can do that. And there is the issue of how to deal with truck weight fees. I entirely agree with you that we should have the truck weight fees returned in some manner to transportation maintenance, especially since it's really the only fee that is applied to weight. Weight does damage roads. Roads need to be repaired due to heavier weight vehicles. That's important to recognize. If we have to put it in the form of a constitutional amendment, I think that's important. I also agree with you that, and maybe I would even go even further than you do, that any future revenue that's dedicated to road repair and safety projects ought to be stabilized for the life cycle cost of repair and stabilizing our road repair deficit that we now have. We need to have a fund that sticks on that and not be diverted into not only other non-transportation purposes, but purposes of transportation projects that various people would want to achieve. And, you know, we've had that discussion. So I think that that's maybe a little narrower viewpoint or philosophy than even you have on a constitutional amendment. I think if we're going to put aside some revenue for repairs, that money should be spent for repairs. And to eliminate the deficit, it should be like focus on like we did with our constitutional amendment for the rainy day fund, dedicated to reducing the wall of debt. This is like a wall of debt. Should be looked at like a wall of debt. We have a maintenance wall of debt. We should reduce that, and I think that's going to be important. How about other members? Senator Cannella.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a co-author on this bill. I think it's a good idea because, again, what we're talking about is increasing taxes and fees on Californians. And maybe that's a fair discussion to have when you look at the state of our roads, but when we have $1 billion in weight fees, as was mentioned, that does not go towards transportation projects, and we have cap and trade funds. We have fuels under the cap, which are from cars, and that's not going towards transportation. I think the public is very much concerned that we're going to raise additional revenue, and where's that going to go? So I think this is, if we're going to talk about revenue, I think this is a very fair discussion to have. And quite frankly, I wouldn't feel comfortable voting for, whether, I don't know if I feel comfortable not voting for additional revenue, but certainly not without a constitutional amendment. So I think this is a good bill. Whatever we do with transportation funding, I think this is important moving forward. So.
Okay, Senator Rakowski and Senator McGuire.
What worries me, Senator, is the fiscal emergency. And it seems to me that if this proposed constitutional amendment, we have in the field of education with Prop 98, if we declare a fiscal emergency, we say there may be a situation that arises in the future where we may not be able to give all the money that we want to give to the schools and our children that we love. And everybody wants to do that. But here, the language in this constitutional amendment would say, even what we may have to, what's the word? When you put handcuff, a future legislature that will say that we want to give money to schools, but we can't because this language is so restrictive that we have to give money to the roads. And I served in local governments on the county transportation committee, so I get it. I get that it's important. Can you comment on that this suggestion that I'm making, that the language may be so restrictive that we ignore a potential fiscal emergency at the expense of our other obligations?
Well, actually, as the economy is coming back, the opposite has occurred. Transportation has been at the bottom of the funding heap, and that's why, we're here today. We never do prioritize transportation, and yet Prop 98 guarantees 40% are going to the kids, right? And as the economy is coming back, local control funding formula as well as increased funds, particularly our poor schools or awash-in funds. And, Prop 42 and Prop 22 were the voters' ways to address both sales tax, staying with transportation, saying they couldn't borrow it, and tried to nail the stuff down. They thought they had weight fees down. They just hadn't contemplated that we would get creative with that. And so I think the intent of the voters has been expressed in past propositions like that. When we have emergencies, and I would say that I'll stipulate that most felt we had an emergency when Prop 30 was contemplated, even though I opposed that, and the voters opposed that at levels that didn't look like it would pass. When the legislature, majority, and the governor put their weight behind that, they got it passed because people recognized there was a crisis. And that's even on a line item that is guaranteed funding out of our budget. Transportation has no such funding. So it seems like what this does is really the low-hanging fruit. This is already money being paid into transportation. It really ought to go. Other emergencies will get funded. We just do that, but transportation does not. And at some point, absent action from us, and I was having this discussion with the chair, we will eventually end up with toll roads everywhere because it's the only way we can fund repairs and running our infrastructure. And you can make a case that we're already going that way because the new roads are often, that's how they're built now. But I think this is something to keep faith with the voters. We just have to do, and we have to understand it is an emergency.
I guess my second question, I've raised the point on the VLF is a tax on personal property, and there's other taxes on personal property. And I'm a bit concerned that if we go down this path where we're going to designate the tax that we pay on certain items, that the taxes we pay on clothing is only going to go to this pot, and taxes that paid on candy, I don't even know if we tax candy. No, we don't tax candy, but whatever it is, goes to this pot. Can you address that? Because generally, this has always started off as a general personal property tax, and now we're sort of making it look like it's only for transportation on the VLF. Well, I get the weight rate is different, but just on the VLF.
Yeah, so on the VLF is something that I could certainly pull out because Senator Bell's bill is not addressing that at this point. Having said that, VLF was the only tax that, if collected by the state, was mandated to go back to the local government. That was, since 1935 or so. So it was a little disingenuous that the legislature, when they decided to give up a tax, gave up the one that had to go someplace else anyway. And then, they did that back in the latter 90s. We ended up with some creative triple flip or whatever. And so here we are today. But, that is something that I would not be opposed to pulling out for the purpose of, trying to fit the cure with the problem.
Thank you.
One thing I wanted to correct is that, I hate to correct people, but, it's got to be done. When you look at the weight fees, and Senator Huff and I have looked at the details of the budget for weight fees, almost all that money is going to pay off a transportation bond. So it's actually going to the general fund to pay off the Prop 1B bonds for transportation, of which the expenditure plan for those bonds includes road maintenance, highway projects like Highway 99, 25% for transit projects. But then there's some of the money that's from weight fees that's going to the general fund that's not specified for bond repayment, bond redemption. So I think it's fair to say there are some funds that are coming from the weight fees, and we don't know exactly how much it is, that is not being used specifically for transportation. But almost all of it, when you say it's going to pay off the bonds for Prop 1B, is being used for transportation purposes, even though it's being paid on a general obligation bond that was approved by the voters in 2006. So to me, it's very important to clarify where that money is going, the weight fees. So Senator McGuire.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. A couple things. One, I want to say thank you to the Senator for bringing this forward, and also to the Chair for working with Senator Huff on this important issue. And also, just coming from local government and the frustration I think that we all face, many of us have come from local government, about having those dollars transition worthy causes, but to other causes besides transportation. So support it here today with one item, and I brought it up at the last hearing, and that is on the issue of aircraft, boating, and off-road. In particular for those excise taxes when it comes to aircraft. We're already in a 3-year pattern in which the state is going to have to redirect those tax dollars back to where those fuel tax dollars were spent, to the original airports, and that's an FAA mandate. And before this, assuming this gets through the committee, which I'll be supportive, is that is going to be fixed in this bill, because I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, from our last time, that still needs to be worked on and potentially amended before it hits the floor.
Right. I would work with you on that, as well as pulling out the VLF.
That's great.
Okay, other questions?
Thank you so much.
Senator Gaines.
I don't have a question, but I want to thank Senator Huff for bringing this legislation forward. And I just want to clarify on a few of the comments. Number one, we have a rainy day fund. So if we get into that economic recession, again, we're going to be able to tap in the monies that have been reserved for the future. And that's something that we haven't historically had the luxury of. And in terms of allocation of resources, we've got excess revenue. And I guess the question I keep trying to figure out is, why aren't we allocating the unanticipated excess revenue that's coming into the Treasury towards transportation?
Yeah.
So I support Senator Huff's legislation and look forward to coming up with a resolution.
Yeah. One of the things I'll say on that's a good question, and maybe we can have a discussion on that. But one thing I'll say is, since the weight fees were taken in 2011 by the legislature and the governor, we approved that in the budget. We all voted for it. It's approved. It was a bipartisan approval. We've done some things to protect against these consequences, like unanticipated consequences that Senator Wachowski has mentioned. And that's it. We did create the rainy day fund. That fund is the fund that is tapped into if there's an emergency, if there's a problem. That's the purpose of that fund. So building that fund up is very important. And that my colleagues, is where the money goes after Proposition 98, goes to the rainy day fund, and then what's left over can go to other purposes. So our job right now is to fulfill the voters' mandate that we create that rainy day fund, that we respond by not having these ups and downs of the budget like we've had, that some of us went through in a very painful way, where we had to do a lot of stuff that we didn't really like to do in terms of cuts. I'll mention one that just broke my heart is the cuts over the last 5 years that's being handled in the other committee, which is the Committee on Developmental Disabilities. Just seeing people that are disabled not being able to receive their services, that hits me right in the gut, And that's why we created the rainy day fund, to avoid those kinds of things. But if we're gonna dedicate money to transportation, especially for maintenance, we have to have that ongoing source of revenue that doesn't falter, because if it falters, all we're doing by faltering is creating a deficit in the maintenance, just like it's like creating another wall of debt. So I think that's what the goal of a constitutional amendment would be, is to create a stable, ongoing source of funds to sustain a maintenance deficit. Now, we've looked at the maintenance deficit, and I've talked to Senator Huff about this. It will take us 10, 15 years to eliminate the deficit, even at the most optimistic levels of funding. Even at the most optimistic levels of funding, it will take 10, 15 years to eliminate the deficit. Now, why is that important? Well, what if we have an earthquake? What if we have a flood like we did the flash flood in the desert that knocked the bridge down? What if we have those kinds of situations? Well, we have to get rid of those unsafe bridges. We have to repair the roads so that the roads don't get washed out and destroyed. We can't be sitting around underfunding these things while the situation is getting worse and worse and waiting for something to happen like that, because you know that it's going to happen. We're going to have an earthquake. We're going to have those floods. And when we do, we better be ready for them. And to come out with some proposal that underfunds transportation, maintenance, and repair is unconscionable, because all you're doing is recreating a worse situation than you had before. And that just passes it on to the next generation. And if, say we do have a horrible flood or maintenance problem, for me, be prepared, right? Be ready. That's what we're supposed to do. Repair all the broken down bridges, repair all the broken down streets, the unsafe facilities that we have, repair them, and do it as quickly as we can. And, I'm very frightened for the potential injuries and deaths that would be caused by not being prepared. So I think we can't just do in my culture we call it a rabbit's foot handshake, where we're really not shaking our hands. We're offering a rabbit's foot instead of your hand. That's kind of like a phony agreement. A phony agreement. We got to have an agreement that's a real agreement between all the parties here. So I'm willing to make a real agreement. That's what I'm for. So we have to be ready. We have to. We can't give up on the goal that we have. So, Mr. Chair, Senator Liu.
Thank you, Senator Bell. Just a point of clarification. Are there amendments to this that?
No, he's agreed to a few amendments already. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, all right.
If we bring it up on the floor. That's
Okay, so this is, and we're not going to hear this bill again, so we'll just, in this committee.
This is our committee. Yeah.
In this committee. Okay, fine. And I was just being mindful of Senator Wachowski's comments about locking ourselves in. I know we have great need in this area, but we also need to have flexibility.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, it's just this conflict here that I will be supportive of the bill. Thank you for taking the amendments. Look forward to a longer discussion at some time in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Senator Berryhill and Senator Cannell.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. First of all, I want to thank Senator Huff for bringing this forward. This is a much-needed bill for the state of California moving forward. I certainly want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for moving the bill. I think that shows a lot of good faith, but I just want to point out that one of the reasons why we have to make this a high priority is because it's been such a low priority for 40 years. And, you know, when you take a look at how much money we put into transportation and then put into other things, and then the monies that we had, you know, when we got in tough times, like everything we took, and what's happened is we haven't maintained the roads at all, so now they're really expensive to fix. So I think even though what Senator Wachowski says is true, I think that in this particular case, you can make the argument that we have neglected our roads for so long. We've got cap and trade money of $200 billion a year that there is no reason in the world why our rural commuters in these mountain counties and Central Valley counties, that money shouldn't be going to maintaining the infrastructure. So, you know, I look forward to certainly staying engaged in this bill. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for moving it forward. And hopefully it doesn't die at this point in time and we can bring it forward to the floor. Thank you.
Senator Cannell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the risk of offending the chair, I just have a couple more comments. All right. You're right that I'm
glad you're here to offend me.
No, I don't want, we've got somebody between us, so I'm glad. But that you're right, this is paying off transportation bonds, but I can't recall another general obligation bond that's being paid for by a special fund. This is, I think, the only one in the state of California, so it's very unusual. When you look at total state funding for transportation, the state spends about $10 billion per year out of $250 billion budget, total budget. So we're talking really a very minor amount of money when you look at the total state budget when we have such a need. So again, we're talking about raising $4, $5, $6 billion more a year for transportation over some period of time. I think it's a fair trade when we're almost going to double the amount of money spent on transportation, taking some potentially very hard votes to say, we know what we're voting for. We're voting, and I think it's just new revenue, I may be mistaken, but we're voting, if we vote for this additional revenue, it's locked in for transportation. So there's a lot of unusual cases here, but I think it's fair to say any new revenue goes towards transportation. That's the only place it can go. So.
I didn't have anything that I disagreed with what you said. That's amazing. Because I think in responding to some of the senators, there's been a lack of attention to the infrastructure of the state. And when I became chairman of the committee this year, I said, we're going to focus on that. And we're going to focus on solving the problems, not just, let's get down to it and let's figure it out and let's solve the problems. So I think that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to focus, solve the problems. It's not going to happen all of a sudden. It's going to take time. We can't have a three-day quickie proposal and expect to have an answer for everything. That's not going to work. We got to spend months and months and months slugging it out, figuring out how to deal with this stuff. And I think if we do it that way in a deliberate way, isn't that what developing good policy, good, strong directions, good strategies is all about. That's the way we should do it. And I've always believed that all of you are smarter than me. I have that philosophy. You have the knowledge from your own experiences that adds up to a lot of knowledge. And that's why we all have to work together to create a consensus. So I'd like to see this go to the floor with some of those suggestions. And if we can have a motion on that.
Mr. Chair, I have some serious reservations about the proposed constitutional amendment in print, but I will move the bill in an effort to continue to work with the author and the rest of the committee.
Okay, thank you. Further discussion, Senator Allen, please.
I just want to, associate myself with Senator Wachowski's comments. I mean, we've all talked a lot about all the various needs, including transit, and just want to make sure that as we're moving forward, we're not undermining some of the core goals that this committee was brought together to discuss.
I'm going to ask people if there's any people that would like to speak. We had a full discussion of this bill last week. So is there anybody who would like to make any comments? Public comment. Okay. Yes, okay, please come forward. Welcome. Have a seat.
Hi, Amanda Eakin with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Appreciate all of your work trying to identify sufficient funding for transportation in the state. It's an absolutely critical need. And as we move forward on parallel tracks with our ambitious climate goals, I want to make sure that we're keeping in mind the need to fund sustainable transportation infrastructure. This constitutional amendment proposes to protect transportation revenues for transportation uses, which I think is very sensible. It also proposes to restrict certain sources of transportation funding to only uses articulated in Article 19, which leave out some critical sustainable transportation uses, such as rail cars, buses, and transit operations. So why we would at this point understand the need completely to keep transportation revenues for transportation makes a lot of sense, but why we would make restrictions on this revenue in ways that move us away from our climate goals and our sustainability values is still a question for us. So we want to make very, very sure that we do not undermine all of the great sustainability planning that's gone on through SB 375, inspired by all of your work, with this constitutional amendment. And we don't see that Article 19 restriction as necessary. And in fact, we see it as counter to the state's world-leading climate goals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What was your representation? What group?
I represent the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Any further comments from senators? Senator Huff, would you like to close?
Understanding the abundance of caution expressed here by some of my colleagues, I appreciate your support in moving this forward today and look forward to working with the chairman on taking care of the issues that we've identified mutually. Ask for your aye vote.
This problem's not going away. We need to continue to work. Call the roll, please.
The motion is be adopted and refer to the Committee on Appropriations. Bell?
Aye.
Bell, aye. Canella?
Aye.
Canella, aye. Allen? Allen, aye. Bates? Bates, aye. Berryhill? Berryhill, aye. Gaines? Gaines, aye. Hertzberg? Leyva? Leyva, aye. Liu? Liu, aye. McGuire?
Aye.
McGuire, aye. Mendoza?
Aye.
Mendoza, aye. Pavley? Wachowski?
Aye.
Wachowski, aye.
He choked it down.
I feel the love. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Huff, that's 11-0. We'll leave it on call for absent members to vote, and we'll proceed immediately to Senator Bates' legislation. Senator Bates, you have the floor.